Okay, guys, I think we can start. So thank you for joining. This is our last day of the Fundamentals webinar. As always, we will start from talking about what we did yesterday and short plan for today. I will remind you the training process, and then we'll proceed with the theory. Today, we have only one topic, and then we plan some longer question and answer session. So we'll see how many questions will be there, and then we will see at what time we can do the break. Okay, so let me start sharing, and let's start. Okay, you should be able to see my screen right now. Let me just take this. Okay, so the training process, just in case somebody is first time joining, I'll be trying to show as many examples as possible because this is the best way to learn. So there will be some examples in the UI. Most I will try to show you in IDE because for me it's just a little bit easier to navigate between classes and to actually highlight some elements. Usually we had a question and answer session at the end of each topic. Today there is only one topic, so right after it we're gonna do a short break, like 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll do the question and answer session. And today this session is not only about today's theory. It will be if you have any question to something that we discussed during this training, or maybe not even related, we can discuss it. If I will be able to answer, I will do this right now, even if this will take a little bit more time. Otherwise, I will ask you to post this question to the Slack channel where we can take it further. As always, slides will be sent to you after the webinar along with the recording, so you don't have to worry about this. And here is the link to the Slack channel. I will also copy this to the chat. And please use the chat if you have any comments or any suggestions. If you have questions, please use the question answer tab, as it will be easier for me to track the answers. I have this. There are 2 comments already in the chat. So Marius, hi guys, any chance at some points the Docker background file can be updated so they can be more up to date? Marius, I don't think we are planning to update the background, but if you ask on the Slack channel, Andre shared the Docker configuration recently, and this should be quite up to date. So please ping there, and I think Andre will give you the link. And Jordi, the screencast of yesterday's lesson seems to be broken. Okay, I will check. Actually, it's weird because I was able to play it from the G drive. But thank you for reporting. Guys, anybody else has any issues with this recording from yesterday? If so, please ping me and we will check what can we do with it. I still have the original file, so there should be no issue to fix if there is any problem. But right now, let's talk. So yesterday we have 3 topics. So we talked about the API, we talked about the message queue, and about the integration. I know that I'm saying nearly before every topic that this is very important, but actually this is really a fundamental. So in most of your projects, most of the customizations of Oro, you're gonna use knowledge that we have in those topics. Of course, some of the in a lesser or bigger part, but really you're gonna use those. You're gonna write the migration. Usually you're gonna customize some API, and nearly on every project you're gonna create some asynchronous functionality using the message queue. Okay, so at the very end we talked about the practice session for the message queue, and we're gonna see the solution right now just to see if this is how you would approach it, or you would, for example, have different vision. Okay, so the idea was to create example field for the user naming type. So as you remember, we were generating this example on the fly. Right now we want to store it and to do this with the migration. Okay, so there is my IDE. And of course, to run a migration, we need to create it in migration schema 1.3. And it's a pretty simple one. We extend our table, and we add the example string is a type, and then we have some attributes like length, and it doesn't have to be contain any value. Okay. As a good approach, we should also update the installer. So we updated the installer. Now it's 1.3, and so we added the example here. Thanks to this, we can see the structure, the data structure of the bundle, just looking at the installer. As I remember, of course, it should also be added to the entity. This is entity, we have control over this, so we did not have to create this field as extended. So as you can see, we do not have any extended field here. Just a second, my ID froze for a second, and now user naming type. We have an example, okay? So this is doctrine column. This is not like created in cache. We have full control, so we should proceed with normal functionality, right? It will be just better for performance. So we created the column, we have the migration, we execute migration, running migration load or a platform update. And then the idea is that every time user naming type is created or format is changed, we need to asynchronously generate name example. If we want to do something asynchronously, usually we need to send a message with the producer. If this is new custom functionality, probably we need to register a new topic. And then we need to create a processor that's going to handle the functionality for us. Okay, and actually, it's a very trivial thing to do. So we can create the async directory where we can put everything related to asynchronous processing. And we have a topics class. Inside, we only have a list of const values where we have the topics. This is just better than copying the value here in the producer and the same one in the processor. First of all, you will not make a typo, and also you will be able to link quite easily. So we create the topics, and then we have event listener, which is just entity listener. Oh, sorry, not this one, of course, this one. As you can see, it's entity listener for our entity, and it's listening on post persist and pre-update. So post persist, we always want to send the message. On pre-update, it was requested to update only when the format changed, right? Because if format didn't change, the example will also not change. We can change the title of this formatting, but it will not change the example. So we are checking the change field, and if the format is in the list, we are sending the message. Sending the message is just injecting the message producer to your listener, and then message producer sent. The first argument is a topic, so we are using this cont value, and the second one is the message. Please remember the message should be as small as possible to be able to handle it in the processor. So we are not sending the entity, we are sending the ID, and then the processor should fetch this from the database. That's it. We have a listener, and we are sending the message. Now we need to handle this message when the consumer gets it. So we go back to this async directory, and we create the processor. Here we need to always implement message processor interface, and usually we go with the topic subscriber interface. First one requires the process method. The second one requires the get subscribed topics. Okay, so the get subscribed topics, we're gonna take a look first. We just return the list of the topics. So one message producer can react to many topics. For example, it can be generate one or generate many examples. Then can be different topics, handled a little bit differently. If your processor receives the message, it will go to the process. We will decode the body, always validate the message if it contains the required fields. If not, you should just reject, because even if you requeue this message, it will not be fixed, right? Requeuing the message means sending exactly the same message to the message queue. And if the field was missing, it will be again missing. So there is no point requeuing it. So you just reject it. And then proceed with the functionality of your processor. In this case, we are fetching the naming type, setting the example, flashing it, and then returning acknowledged. So we did it. Then we could modify the fixture or create a new one, it's up to you. Here we created a new one, generate new formats. Here in the fixture, we can fetch all the naming types you already have. And for each, generate example of the format of the name and just flash it. Okay, so again, pretty simple one. We could do the same here, but if somebody created one from the UI, it will not be updated by this fixture. So this is not the best approach. The last one, and we are not going to see it, is replace manual example generation with extracting of value from the entity. So as you remembered in the view pages or in the API meta field, we were calling this full name provider. Right now we don't need it. We just provide the value from this field. And that's it. If you have any questions related to this one, please post them to the question answers so you just not forget them. We will be answering them later. Right now, let's jump to today's topic, which is workflows. And this is functionality I really like. It took me a while to get familiar with it and to understand its benefit. But right now, I really appreciate what it can do without creating any special classes or complex functionalities. So first of all, what is the workflow? And do you use it a lot? And actually, if you think about it, most of you use it every day, because a great example of a workflow is a code review. Okay, so workflow is just some state machine. So you have some states, and you have transitions that move the state of your entity from one step to another. Okay, if you think about the code review, this is exactly what it's like. So you have some step that's open, then you have some transitions, so you can close the ticket or you can start progress. Then you also, again, have two transitions. You can start the progress or you can close it. Okay, so this is a perfect example of simple workflow. In Oro, you can create workflows for different entities. For example, the checkout is a workflow. This is a very big workflow, but actually it's really based on exactly same ideas that you're gonna see today. And the checkout will be covered in more details in the next webinar series. Also, we have workflows, so lists or opportunities. You can enable or disable them. This is up to you. But today we're gonna see how you can create them and work with them. So, in general, this is a state machine. It's always assigned to an entity. The step and the states, this is actually the same. You can use whichever name you prefer. We have something like internal data. So workflow can have access to the data of the entity it is assigned to, but also it can have values by itself. So for example, you can modify the value for the entity, but also if the workflow has few steps, you can get some value from the user and store it in the workflow itself. And then in following steps, you can access this value and, for example, have different functionality assigned. Then if you want to change the state, this is actually execution of the transition. And for transitions, we have transition definition. So this is a list of actions and conditions that's gonna be checked and execute whenever you perform this transition. And this is really a huge benefit of using workflows. So you can assign some transition, and to this transition, you can assign really complex flows without creating classes and logic in code, just reusing ready-to-use blocks called actions. And also, you can create some data restrictions, like entity restrictions. For example, specific status can be restricted to only selected values in scope of this workflow. So let's see how it works from the UI. So first of all, we can create a simple workflow just from the UI of the application. We go to the admin console, and we create some simple workflow from the contact. So first, I will show the contact view that there is no workflow assigned there yet. We're gonna continue using Deborah's example contact. If there will be workflow assigned, you will see a workflow bar just above the general information section here about the tabs. So you can see there is none. We can go to the system and there are workflows here. If you are not familiar with the application, I know exactly where it is already, but please use this quick search. It's really convenient to use. And here I have the entities. Let's check if I have one for contact. No, there is none. So I can create one. We have some name for this. We choose to which entity you want to assign it. The condition for the entity to be on this list is that it has the single column identifier, okay? It will not work for the columns with the complex IDs yet. We're gonna talk about the exclusive active group and exclusive records group later on. And we can create some steps. As you can see, I don't have any steps yet. So we can add a step. We can call it init, for example. Set it as default. And then we can add additional step. We're gonna create a very simple workflow that will allow you to set the links for your social media, like for example, for Twitter or Facebook, okay? So we're gonna create a step Facebook. And we can create step Twitter. And now we can create some transitions between those. Okay, so from init to Facebook, we can define if there should be a form on a separate page on a pop-up, because each transition can have some separate form where you can ask user for attributes or from any values. And also here we can style the buttons and you have the preview at the bottom. Now, if I want to use attributes, I have access to the entity fields and also to the relations. I want to use Facebook. And I can leave it empty. I can make it required and I just add it. Okay, so I created a form with just one field. I can apply it. And here there is a diagram. We should be able to move those and you will see that it is creating the transition and the diagram for us. So let's do it like this. Okay, and then we want to add another transition. And from the Facebook step to a Twitter step, again pop-up, and we'll ask for the Twitter. Again, it will be required. We have it, and we can, let's say, reopen. So last transition, it will be from the Twitter to init, and there is no attributes required. Okay, so this is how it could look like, right? Okay, let's save it. Oh, this one is also nice. I will show you how it works in a second. Displaying steps ordered. So I should clear the cache, and also I should activate. So let's clear the cache first, so the transitions will be generated. Translations, excuse me. Okay, and let's go back to those workflows and enable this. When you create it, is disabled by default. So webinar demo, and we can enable just clicking the tick here. it asks me if I want to deactivate any other workflow. So if I know that some workflows are in conflict with this one, I could deactivate them at the moment when I activate my one. There is no conflict because I do not have any other workflows assigned to contact. And now if you go to Debra, I can start the workflow. Also, I could configure that it will be auto-started. And right now, here, I am in the step init. So I have a button to perform the transition to add Facebook. As you can see, I do not have those information here. Okay, I have no information about social media at all. I can add it. I can add some link. I can submit. As you saw, it was required. Now the transition is performed. I'm moved to the tab Facebook, and I have added the information. So the attribute I filled in the form was stored in the entity itself. And now I can perform the second transition, which is add Twitter. Again, transition is performed. URL is added to the list of social media. And the last step I can reopen. Okay, so this was very simple. Of course, I can do much more using the code and creating them in the YAMLs. But for some simple cases, you can use the UI. Also, I told you about the displaying step ordered, so I can deactivate it for a moment and then edit. And let's mark this one. And this will work only if your workflow doesn't have forks, right? So if there will be two transitions available from some point, it will not work so nice. But right now, as you can see, this is a very simple workflow, and it's always one transition to lead to another step. And thanks to this, oh, let's activate it. Thanks to this, it can be displayed as a timeline, okay? So I can see step by step what's happening. Let's start with a different contact that we didn't play with yet, like John. And here I can start it, and I can go step by step. So this is the difference. I can add Facebook. As you can see, it's displayed as a step. So this is very, very nice way to present those things. Okay, so this was just an example how you can do this from the UI. As we already talked, in most of the cases, you will be doing this from the code perspective. So let's continue. First of all, you have the workflow definition. You see me clicking it through the UI, but actually it was stored to the database. Usually it will be created in the workflow YAML. And then with the comment Oro workflow definitions load, it will be loaded to database, cache will be created, and then workflow will be presented and work on the front store of the application. Actually, you can create workflow for the front store and different workflow for the backend of the application. Right now, you've seen the workflow for the backend. When you think about the front store, as I told you, there is a checkout. So, and creating a checkout is a workflow. So you can put whole workflow in a single file, but usually they can grow quite big. In this case, we can make separate files and just include them with imports like for other YAML files. So for example, let's see the checkout workflow. Okay, so here you can see this is my main file and importing additional files. Okay, so I have attributes in different files, step in different files, transition, definition. Every section I have in separate file. thanks to this, those are not that large and are simple. It's a little bit simpler to find something. Then we also have our workflow debug workflow definitions. This can be useful in few cases. First of all, we can check what definition is generated for the workflow we've done from the UI. So let's run this command. Okay, let me just clean it. And there we go. So I can execute this command. Okay, so I have the list of the workflows. Actually, this is pretty the same table I can see in the UI. So it's not very useful. But if I specify the ID of the workflow next, I will debug this one. So the one that we created here, it's called webinar demo. We can get its ID. As you can see, it was auto-generated, so there is also some hash. And this will give me the definition of this in the YAM. So I could just copy this now to the YAM file, modify it, and work on. So I could use it for creating, like, the boilerplate for my workflow. Of course, you can just copy different workflow and just modify it, but this is an option. So here I can see that the steps were generated, and I have init, Facebook, Twitter. The transitions were generated, and for each transition, I have the form. So I have the form options, and so on. Okay, as you can see, there was no transition definitions. I mean, they were empty. And the same goes for the variable definition, for example. And there was no force auto start, so I had to click this start workflow button. Also, this was loaded to the database. So we can open workflow definition table. And here you have the workflows. And at the very bottom, there is the one we created. It has some start step assigned. It has label. It always has the information to which entity is assigned. And here there is a configuration. So this is the workflow definition in a hash form. Okay, so this is the first entity when we have the definition of the workflow. Then we also have the translation for the labels, and this is very important. Translation for the workflows are stored in different domain. So as you remember, we stored the translation in the resources translations, and it was messages, name of your localization YAM. Right now it will be workflows, name of the localization YAM. Okay, so you have to remember they are being stored in different namespaces. And here there is a very useful comment. We have Oro workflow translation done. So we created this workflow, and right now, if you would like to override the translation, we should create this workflow YAM and then put all the translation strings there and provide some labels. But instead, we can use this comment. So if you go back here, it's missing the argument. So we can provide the argument, which will be again workflow ID. And voila, we have the ready translation file. So we can copy this, move it to workflows.en.yaml, for example, and just provide the labels. And that's how you can create simple translation for a workflow. So really useful one to generate. Even if you created workflow by yourself in the YAML, you can use this command to generate the scaffolding of translation file. You've seen already that you can add simple definitions from the UI. And you're also going to see today that you can create custom definitions from the YAML. Now, one of the most important entities in the workflow is workflow item. This represents the status of specific entity in specific workflow. So once we started the workflow for the contact, the workflow item for this specific entity in this specific workflow was created, and if there is any data not related to entity itself. So we modified the Twitter and the Facebook URLs for the content. Those are attributes related to entity itself, so we do not need to store them in the workflow item, right? Because they belong to entity, we store them in the entity, and that's it. If we would have any attributes related to workflow, it will be stored in this workflow item in serialized form. So let's see it. We have the workflow item, and let's just reorder. As you can see, the first one is using our workflow. It's for the entity 53. If you go and check the Debra, it will be probably 53. For sure, she will be. Oh, excuse me, it's 53 because we started also it for the second. Yeah, we started it for the John later on, right? Yeah, so he will be 53. Yeah, so we started for the John, and John is in the step Facebook, so we can hit the current step is 77. We also have the workflow step table, and here we can check the 77 is the Facebook. So workflow item knows what entity, because this entity ID and this is entity class, so what specific entity in which workflow is in what current step at this moment, right? So this is all we need to know. And also here would be any data if you had some workflow related information. Then we have the steps. So step is the step of the workflow, the state. We also have the table for this and the entity for this. They are ordered. And very important thing is that step knows about possible transitions. So if I'm in the step Facebook, I know what transition can be performed further on. So in our case, it was at Twitter. I do not know what transitions lead to myself, right? So as a step, I know what can be done further, but I don't know what transition moved this entity to my step. So this is important information. And then workflow may have only one start step. It can be many starting transitions, but always one starting step, and might have one or more final steps. And about the final steps, when I was creating this workflow, for each step, I had the possibility to define if this is final or not. And this is very important for you that from the workflow point of standpoint, this doesn't mean anything. So this is for us to understand if we need, for example, to do some check, if this is final or not. If I make it final, it doesn't mean that there can be no reopen transition, for example, and then I can continue the workflow. It is the same as with the review. I can mark it as deployed to the production, which usually is a final step. But if there are some critical or any bugs, I can reopen it, right? So is final is just the information, then this step is final. For order, it can be returned or shipped, right? Those are final steps. But still, if I have some logic, I can reopen and continue. So it's just for the reporting or for you to know, understand, for example, how many items already finished the workflow. Okay, so this is just a flag. And it's up to you as the user to ask any logic related to it. So how steps looks like in the workflow definition file? It's actually very simple. We have the workflows namespace, then we have the name of the workflow, and then we have steps. As I remember, this is also pretty well hinted. So let's see it. Resources, config, Oro, workflows, YAML. I already have some workflow here, but yep, I have hints for every thing I can do in the workflow. So again, please configure your ID properly and use it. So then we have the step name. We have order, and what transitions can be performed if my workflow is in this step. If there are some conditions to perform this transition, they will be added to the transition itself, not here. Also, I can mark it as final, right? So very simple to define the steps. And here, this is actually opportunity flow. So I can have open opportunity, and from open, I can develop. So I can add some additional information, which probably will lead back to the open state. So it's not checking the state. And then I can close it as won or as lost. Then we have the attributes. And they can represent the data of the workflow, which will be stored in the workflow item, or they can be stored in the entity. So the main entity is also an attribute. Okay, so I have access to the entity that my workflow is assigned to. So if I start the workflow for Debra, inside the workflow, I will have access to this entity and to all of these fields. And also I should define them in the attributes. So workflow will know if this attribute is related to some property of this entity, or this is like additional field that should be stored in the workflow. So how the attributes are defined, again, easy to read and understand. We follow the same idea. So we have the workflows namespace, we have the name of the workflow, attributes section, and then we have list of the attributes. As you can see, for most of them, actually, yeah, for nearly every, we have the property path, which means this is the entity attribute. And here we bound the main entity of this workflow to the opportunity. How we can do this, I will show you later. But for example, close reason name is just a string. So it's not bound to the specific property of this entity. Now, and this is really important. You can be frustrated if you gonna use attributes in the wrong way. So you can access attributes inside your workflow YAM in few ways. First of all, you can have $sign, which is just a special namespace, dot data dot status, and this will return the value of the attribute status. You can use the short notation, which is just dollar and the name of the attribute, and it will return exactly the same value. Then we have special namespace called $.result, and there you can store any information that this is not persisted. For example, I have quite big transition. In the first step, I'm fetching the email of the notifier in my system. So in the configuration of the system, you can specify the email address, and all emails that are notifications should be sent from this address. In my workflow, I would like to send some email, so I'm calling the config, and I'm fetching this email address. So I can store it in some temporary variable. So I will call it, for example, $.result.notifier email, and I have access to this through all this transition, but it will not be persisted anyway, just for the time being of the transition and all the actions inside it. So this is special namespace, $.result, and then I can use any information, and this variable will be created. I can put some value there and then check it. And the one you don't want to use is to go with $.status, okay? So this will tell you there is not no property like this in the workflow item. So this is how you can access any property of the workflow item entity itself. So you don't have status there, so this is not how you would like to call it. Now, we also can have variables. You're gonna see this in a better example during the checkout exercise, but variables are some configuration that you can, first of all, configure in your YAM, but also later on, you can change it from the UI. So for example, we have something called alternative checkout, which is mostly for demo purposes. And let's see it. As you can see, is the only one that have the clock icon here, is because there is some variable assigned to it. And here I can define its value. So I have order approval threshold and some description. if I provide the value here, or in the YAM, I can provide the default value. As you can see, there is one already filled in, so this is the default value. Later on, I can access this information just as I would access any attribute and do some conditions. For example, in this workflow, I will be checking if my order total is above this value, and if yes, I would need to request manager for approval of my order. Otherwise, I will just create it in the normal way. So this is how you can add some additional configuration to your workflow and then maintain it from the UI. So this is how this is configured. I have the variable definitions. By the way, here you have workflow YAM in one file. You can see it's a pretty long one. So I recommend split this into the section and use imports, and then you have steps, transitions, variables, attributes, everything in separate file, and it's simpler to find something. But still, it's gonna work anyway, and the performance is the same because they are being loaded to database anyway. So here I created variable, I created the name, defined the type, default value, and the form that should be displayed in the UI. So it is displayed as a text, and it cannot be blank, it's required. Okay, so I can add more variables and later on check them in my workflow. As we said at the beginning, we also can add some additional entity restrictions. So for example, I have 10 internal statuses, but in the workflow, I want only few of those to be available. So I can assign this restriction to a step. So it will, for example, during this step, I can assign only those specific statuses, and in different step, I can assign different one. So there are few modes of restriction: full, so I can do everything. I can disallow and then specify the list of those that are disallowed, or I can allow, excuse me, and then specify the list of those that are allowed. Example, we have the opportunity status creation. So this is the name of the restriction, we can create it. Then to which attribute it's added and which field. We can mode and won and lost. Okay, so we will not be able to assign status won or lost. Right? So this is how you can modify the statuses, or for example, or any other attributes, and restrict the values of those. And of course, docs. Oh, broken link. Okay, I will try to fix it. Workflow configuration. All right, I will check it. Oh. Then, once we have steps, we have the attributes, we need to define the transition, how we can move between the steps and change the state of the workflow. They always link two steps and lead from one step to another. One transition always have the first, the starting step and the ending step. Workflow can have one or more starting transitions. So for example, order. Order can have one start step, for example, choose the shipping address, but there can be many transitions that can lead to it. So we can start order from the shopping list, we can start order from the quick order form, or we could start order from the quote. So those will be three starting transitions, but they all lead to the same starting step, which is select the shipping address. Every transition, and this is what you've seen also in the UI, may have a form with attribute fields. So in this form, I have access to all the attributes that I defined. And if this attribute already have the value, it will be displayed in this input. Okay. Also, as you seen yesterday, I can have restriction for the, I can have ACL restriction for each workflow transition. So I can disable whole workflow for specific user, I mean from viewing or for performing the transition, or I can restrict only specific transitions. For example, I have the workflow, so my client could select the shipping step, could select the billing address, could select the shipping method and billing payment method, but the last transition, which is create order, could be allowed only for the manager, for example. And also we can have assigned condition, so the transition will be available only if certain conditions are met. For example, we can close the order only if it was not updated for at least 1 month. Okay, so we can create some transition, and these buttons will be clickable only if those conditions are met, or we can hide it if the conditions are not met. And the important thing, it might have related actions. What are the actions? We're gonna talk about in a second. How we can define the transitions is very similar how we define the steps. So again, we have the workflows namespace, we have the name of the workflow, we have transitions. This is the special transition, which is start. But let's look, for example, at develop. First of all, transition knows to which step it leads. So it's step to open. We can define if it should be hidden if you are not able to click it. Then we can specify some front-end options like style it, add some component or icon or class. What is the transition definition? We always need to specify transition definition. Few transitions can reuse the same one if they have the same logic. And also this transition definition can be empty. And for example, in today's practice, it will be. Then we can, but we don't have to, attach some form to this transition. So as you remember, in the UI, I had the option if this form should be a pop-up or a new page. So the same, if this is a pop-up, there will be a pop-up during transition. Otherwise, it will be displayed as full page form. And once you store it, you perform the transition. So for the form, you specify the attribute fields that should be used. And for each field, you can specify for each attribute which form component should be used and also additional options. Okay, so here you build the form. For example, if you have the status select, you can exclude some values from the select, just like you would do with the restrictions. If there is nothing to configure, you just specify the field and then tilde. Okay, so this is how you go with the transitions. I know that this looks like a weird way to configure something, but once you create your first workflow or modify the checkout, you will see that you can really create a complex functionalities using this pseudocode and reusing the actions that already exist. So you will see that you don't really have to create anything new in many cases to create whole new process or whole new functionality. So I really recommend you give it a try. Then we have the transition definition. So it represents the actions that should be performed when this transition is clicked. You've seen something very simple. I was just storing some value of the entity. I could just edit this entity and do this myself. But what if, for example, when I added an avatar, I should send an email, for example, or I could perform any other action? We can also do this with workflows and also just reusing the ready blocks. So for this, we have the transition definition. And in each transition definition, we have 4 important keys. We have pre-actions and preconditions. Then we have the actions and conditions. Okay, so let's see this actually in the YAML. We don't, as you can see, we don't always need to use all of those. And here actually, we are using only actions and conditions. What are each 4? I will explain in a second. So again, we have the workflows, opportunity flow, transition definitions, and this is transition definition name. As you remembered from the second, previous example, I was specifying this transition definition for each transition. So I know that when my develop transition is going to be performed, there will be those additional actions. So first, the form will be displayed. So this is the first is the form. And once the form is submitted, the actions of this transition definition will be executed. So for example, for develop definition, I have some conditions. As you can see, I can have many. So I will be able to perform this transition only if the status is not equal lost or neither won. Okay, so if the status is won or lost, this transition will not be available for me. Otherwise, I will be able to perform it. And also we have some actions, and this is what will be executed once I perform the transition. And let's open this in the IDE. So it's opportunity for flow transition definitions. Ouch. So I have those actions, and okay, it's not okay, not building my cache yet. So I can use those actions. I should have hints here also. Let's check. Yeah. So as you can see, I have the hints, what actions I can use, and there is a lot. So there are actions created for many useful cases. It's super simple to create new ones if I need to. And then using those actions, I'm creating quite complex processes. Here, it's not that complex, but I can create many actions. Like for each action, I can have separate conditions. I can group those actions using trees and so on and so on. So this is really a good way to create complex functionalities reusing some blocks. So let's try to read it. First, we request an enum entity. Enum entity is like the dictionary. So we are fetching the won status from the opportunity status entity, and we are assigning this to this attribute, which means that we created this attribute previously. Then we are using find entity, which is probably just performing some query. Yeah, by condition or by reference, depending how you use it. And we are fetching the close reason. We are assigning the close reason one to the close reason attribute. And for example, checking the probability. Okay, so you can see we can call any service method, or we can call any specific action we just created, or there is a lot already created for us. For example, I can create objects, I can assign values, I can send email template, really do a lot. No. So what are those actions? So actions is a small block of functionality which may have parameters and may have some conditions. So you already seen action. So I can have action to create entity or create just an object. I have action to send email template. And those are just small services that are designed to do one thing. Okay, so it can return some values, and then these values will be assigned to attribute. And then I can use it in another action, and so on, and build functionalities using those small blocks. So how can I create new action? I just create a service, and I tag it with Oro action, dot action. So let's see it. And there we go. So for example, get order line items. So you see those are for the checkout probably, send order confirmation email. Okay, we have an action. So when I tag the service, this is the alias, and this is the name of the action also. So here, I would be able to use this action. It was send order confirmation email. It's ready. And as I remember, it should also give me some hints about the attributes for it. Okay, so I create an action, and here I just want to invoke this. So let's see the definition of this action. Let's go back here. As you can see, it's just a class, and here execute. And what should happen when I execute? This one actually just extends the send email template. And here there is information how to execute an action. So I should get the email address from the context. I should get the template from the context and just send an email. Okay, so I can create new actions. Very simple. It's just a service tagged properly, and then reuse it on my workflows. And as you're gonna see soon, the workflow is not the only place when you can use those actions. So you create this once, and then you just reuse them using different configuration. It's really, really quite flexible solution. And it's really good on performance too, because once you created this set of actions, it's stored in the workflow definition database and also properly cached. If you would like to get list of all action, there is a command to debug the container, which usually just returns the services, but you can debug with specifying the tag. So it will return all the services tagged with Oro action. So let's try it. And we have the service ID, alias, and the class name, and we have the list of the actions, right? Something very similar to action and also used in the workflows are conditions. Conditions are also very small chunks of codes, properly tagged. The difference is they do not perform something, they do not have special functionality, they only check some condition for you. So they should return true, they have to return true or false, and then you can check the condition, and based on its result, you can perform some action or not, all right? So again, it may have parameters. For example, if you want to have instance of condition, the parameter will be then object, and then it will check the instance of this object, if this is given class or not. And the only difference is how you tag it. So you have our action condition. Actually, let's try it with the container list already. So there is a condition. And there you go. So condition is not equal. You can check if something is extendable, if something has elements, is less than equal or less than. Okay, so those are just conditions. So if you think about them like if statement or something like this, and as you can see, there is quite a lot already created. For example, you can check if some ACL is granted or if the payment methods is applicable, all right? If you would like to create your condition, again, you just create a service, tag it with Oro action condition, and that's it. Also, I gave some links here, and this is the example. In the example, you see the basic actions defined in the action bundle, quite few of those, and additional bundles can add more, for example, checkout bundle, and also quite good documentation, how the actions work, how you can create one, and so on. The same goes with the conditions. Again, those links are mostly for you guys. And before I show you how we can also reuse those actions and conditions, there is last topic about the workflow, which are translations. As I told you, they are in the separate domain, and this is really important, otherwise you're gonna modify your translation strings in the default domain messages, and it will not work. So really, please remember, this is in workflows, then it's in locale.yam. And also, if you create a workflow, the best way to start doing the translation is to dump the localization for this workflow. There is a comment in the second slide, as I remember. Okay, so otherwise, it's just a translation file. Nothing specific, nothing really interesting here. So, as I told you, we can reuse those actions and conditions in other places, and this is what makes them so nice to use. So we have the workflows, which is the state machine, and we already have some of those actions created for us. So we can also use them in something called operations. Operation is just an interaction with the user. It can be send email, or it can be download a PDF. You can assign this operation to a data grid, or you can assign it, for example, to any other route, like view page, for both front store or the backend. So let's see it actually. This is full information how you can configure operation. In most of the cases, you don't need many of those fields. But first of all, we have some name. This is important because using this name, you can extend or override the existing operations. If our operation is extending already some other operation, we can define it. If we just want to override some other operation and replace the section, we just say that replace. In this case, the section will not be merged, it will be replaced. This is important if you would like to remove something. Then we can assign it to specific entities, or for all, or just exclude. So there is no point to have all those configurations. So either assign to specific or assign to all, or you can assign to all and exclude some, right? So this is up to you. Where do you want it? Also, you can define the roots and the data grids. So as you remember, I told you that the delete action will be added to data grid automatically. And this is actually the operation. So let's see it in the code. It was actions yam. Oh, from the action bundle. Yeah, this one. No, not this one. This one. So first of all, I have the CRUD action, which is the operation, and I will delete, just extend it. So it's assigned to all entities and all data grids. Then if I want to remove this button because I have the grid and I don't want to have delete there, I can just use excluded data grids. Okay, so I will just create actions yam inside my bundle, extend the delete, or just use the name, and then add the section excluded data grids and provide my data grid name. Then there are conditions. So this action, sorry, preconditions. These actions will be displayed only if those are met. And I told you I was explain what are those 4 sections. So we have pre-actions, preconditions, then we have conditions and actions. So pre-actions are executed when before I display the button for this transition. Okay, so if I need to check some configuration, for example, is this functionality enabled? So I can execute action and get something from config manager and store it in some variable. So I can execute some actions before everything starts to happen. Then I have the preconditions. So in preconditions, I can check if this configuration that I fetched in actions is having correct values. So if preconditions are not met, this button would not be displayed at all. Okay, so pre-actions and preconditions are happening before I even click the button, because if they are not met, the button would not be displayed. Then I have the conditions, so I click the button, and if the conditions are not met, I will have the information that I'm not meeting the conditions to perform this. So this is visible, but I still need to meet some conditions to perform this specific action, transition. And then there are actions. So if everything is correct and the conditions are met, actions are being executed. Okay, so those are 4 sections. You don't need to use all of them. Sometimes you don't have preconditions. You always display this button, for example. So it's the same for the workflow transition, and it's the same for the operations, those 4 sections. And then I can define something, how the button should look like, and also apply specific template or specific JS component. Then I can add some form. So for example, I add this operation, which usually is presented as a button. I add it to the order view page, and this will be sent order confirmation email. And in this form, I will have the input for the email where I want to send this confirmation email or PDF or something. Okay, so there is a form which gets the information before the action will be executed, and then I have those 4 sections. So in the form, there will be request for email. Then in the condition, I could check if somebody filled in the email and if this is correct. If not, it will not be performed. And if the conditions are met, the action will be to send the email. All right. So again, I do not need to create any classes. I just create this actions yam, create new operation, assign it to the view page, which to the specific root or to data grid, and that's it. Then I just add its logic using those actions and conditions, so like pseudocode. I know most of the developers don't like pseudocode. I was really the same, and then I started to use it, and it's really, really flexible and convenient. And you can just, use some blocks, very simple to read this, and that's it. And the last way when you can reuse those, a diagram. It's a good one, so I decided to link it here, is here. So I have the operation, and before showing the operation, I'm executing the pre-actions and the precondition. And here the information that it will start only if the route is matched, entity class, or data grid name. So if any of those are matched, the operation will be attached to this page. Then pre-action preconditions are called. If the preconditions are met, I'm checking if there is a form or not. If there is no form, I'm going straight to the conditions and actions. If there is a form, I'm using form init. So if there are any attributes, I will populate the form with the default values. Also, the user can change or add their own values, submit the form. If this is valid, it will go to conditions. Otherwise, the validation will fail and I will need to fix the form. Okay, so this is how the operation works. And at the very end, the most important things, the actions are being executed. And actions can really be anything. For example, I can have a button, create, duplicate order, and then create some action that will duplicate the order, or anything, right? So any custom logic I can, well, of course there are some limits, but most custom logics I can just create using those operations. And the last way is by using processes. And those are sort of event listeners, but also have some big benefits to use. So process is executed on some events like create, update, delete of entity or specific field of this entity, or also can be executed with cron. So this is just like an event listener or something like this. But again, it's used action as conditions. So I can create some event listeners and do some specific logic on some events. The big gain here is that I can use time shift. So let's see this in the documentation. How I can create the process. First of all, I just create the processes YAML file. And inside I have two keys, definitions and the triggers. In definition, I define the process. So I have some name, I have label. If this is enabled, attach it to entity. I can exclude definition, and this is important one. Exclude definitions means that if I do anything inside of this process that should trigger this process again, to avoid circular reference, I can exclude definitions. This means that even if I change some field and my process will be listening to this field, it will not be triggered again. Okay, so this is to avoid circular references. Then we have the preconditions and the actions configuration. And this preconditions is using the same conditions as in workflows and operation, and actions configuration is using the same actions. Okay? As this is also important for each action, you can have separate conditions also. So for example, send email only if given condition is met. And then the important thing is the trigger. So I have the definition name, and it can have many triggers. For example, it will be always executed at the create event of the entity assigned to the definition. So anytime I create the contact, this definition will be called. So in this case, it's assigning my contact to the admin user. But the one, I can have many triggers where I listen to many events. And here, for example, I can execute this process only if the assigned to field is updated. Okay, and this for now I could just work with normal event listeners, and this will be very simple. The thing I like, you can make it queue, which means that the process will be put on message queue, and the one I really like is the time shift. So let's think we have the functionality that whenever we create an order, we automatically send an email to our customer, and he needs to click the button to approve the order. All right? And because we know that this is not something very common, some of the users just think that this is confirmation email and they never click the button. So we would like to send the email to this client after 2 hours from order creation if he did not approve the order yet, right? So he got the email, he didn't click, and after 2 hours, we should send the email again to just remind him that he has to approve the order for us to stop processing it. So we can create an event using the process definition and have the time shift, and this is in seconds, so this should be 7,200, right, for 2 hours. This means that this process will be executed in 2 hours. Here in preconditions, we will have access, the source is the entity, right? So we will have access to the order. We can check if this is approved or not and send the email or no. If you think about doing this with event listener, it will be little more because you need to, you cannot just act on prep resist or post update because you need to wait those 2 hours. So you could also put it on the queue, create some cron command for this, but the way it will be more complex than just this. So this is for me the biggest benefit of using processes. First of all, you can create simple event listeners just reusing the blocks. For example, for sending emails with specific template. It's very simple in this case. And also you can use a time shift. And the third possibility is you can also do this with cron. So you can create the process and then execute it with cron, for example, every minute. Right? So those are 3 ways to reuse those actions and conditions. So we have workflows, we have operations, and we have processes. And once you start playing with them, I really believe that most of you will see how flexible and convenient it is to use them. Some additional features we're not going to cover at this moment. We also have scopes. So scopes is as I remember, we have the website scope, customer scope, and customer group. So for example, you can have different workflow enabled for different scope. And there is a documentation for you. Ouch. I was pretty sure I just clicked this before. Okay, let me try to Google this. Oh, apps. Workflows. Oh, it was moved to doc bundle already. Okay, I will ping our team and check why the scopes is not here anymore. Sorry for this, guys. And some best practices. So sometimes it's easier and faster to create new big action condition instead of writing huge YAML. So yeah, if this is complex check, I need to check the email, I need to check so on and so on. Instead of creating this chain of actions or condition, I can create my own action that will encapsulate all of this inside one action. Also, it may be faster to write a process instead of creating new event listener. And one really important thing about processes. Once I create a process, I can enable or disable it from the UI. So I created a process that every time the order is created, something happens. And then I'm importing the orders because, for example, I got some data loss and I need to import them. I don't want to notify nobody about this because those are not order being created. I'm just importing them back to the database. So here I have all the processes with the information of the execution order, if this is enabled, to which entity is attached, and also inside on what event. So it can be cron expression, or let me find some other. It's a text representation of update event, right? So immediately after status have been updated. And if I don't want this process to be enabled, I just can deactivate it. You will not be able to do this within an event listener. So I can deactivate it, import my orders, reactivate it, and that's it. Okay? I don't need to deploy something or hack the production to comment the listener, which in many environments actually you even won't be able to do. Then, if you would like to customize the workflow, you should copy it, okay? Those are YAMLs, but they are not being merged. And also, if you modify it and then you update the platform and the base will somehow change, you can have some issues. So If you want to modify the workflow, you copy the workflow definition, change the name, deactivate the previous workflow, activate yours, and modify it whatever you like. And now, if you think about the workflows, one thing I told you I'm gonna talk about at the end. When we go to these workflows, we had these action groups. So we have exclusive active group and exclusive record group. As you can see, we have few workflows for the checkout. We have the alternative checkout, which is the one with configuration. We have the checkout and the single page checkout. As you can see right now, a checkout and alternative checkout is enabled, but the single page is disabled. So first is the exclusive active group. It means that only one workflow with this action group can be enabled. So if I would like to enable single page checkout, I would have to disable every workflow sharing the same action group. So if I click here, he will tell me that I need to disable the checkout, and it will be disabled because they share the same active group, exclusive active group. Okay, so this is just the information, that, for example, that I can use only one workflow or another, or they have some conflicts and so on. The second is exclusive record groups, which means that they all can be active at the same time, but only one for specific record. So I can have alternative checkout and checkout enabled at the same time because they have different exclusive active group. But if I start one of those workflows for the checkout, I will not be able to start the other one. So only one can be enabled for one entity, one specific entity object at this moment, right? So this is what are those groups. So whenever you would like to customize the checkout, for example, you should have the same active group. So whenever you active your custom checkout, the default one should be disabled. And as you saw, you can dump the whole configuration of existing workflow using the command. So for example, if you would like to copy, you can dump it, copy from the console the definition file, place it in your bundle, and change the name. Before we go to the questions and answers, I will show the solution of the practice, and then we can start the discussion. So just a second, let me find it. And let me close because there is enormous way of tabs already. And there we go. So build a simple workflow for user using YAML configuration. So the workflow is for the user, not for the user naming. Then we should create the steps. Name is not initialized, which will be the start step. Name parts are set, and name format is set. Then we have the transitions. Set name parts, which are leading from this step to this step. Set name format, from name parts are set to name format is set. And reinitialize name, as you can see, assigned to 2 steps. So also, yeah, transition, like reopen, for example, in code review, can be assigned to many steps. This is how it would look like. Excuse me for a second. Okay, so black boxes are the steps, and the arrows are the transitions. Additionally, we should add the form set name parts to the transition. Add form to this set name for transition that will show the 5 name parts. So the prefix, name, middle name, last name, and the postfix. And set name format should display the drop-down with the name format type. And there are some hints if you would like to do it by yourself. Right now, I will just show it how it can be done. So this is really practice I like. And actually, it just requires you to create one file, which is workflows YAM. So first, we start from creating workflows YAM inside resources config Oro. Then we have the workflows namespace. We have the name of the workflow. We specify to which entity is applied. And here we have the entity attribute. So we will have access to this entity object under this name. We specify which should be the start step, which is not initialized. And in defaults, for example, if this should be active by default. So whenever I run workflow definitions load, and please remember you need to execute this command every time you change the workflow, and also it's executed during the platform update. Then we have some attributes. As you can see, all of the attributes here are the entity properties, so I do not have any workflow attributes. So then we just jump to the task and we have the steps. Okay, so I create the steps. So those are the code names. And then I have order. And for each step, I have the transitions, also taken from here. So I have 3 steps and the transitions assigned. Then I have the transitions. I have very simple transitions, so they all have some transition definition because they have to. But as you can see, they are all empty. So there is no any specific actions assigned. But if, for example, during set name parts definition, I would like to send some email, it will be as simple as creating actions block. And then send email template, specify the template and recipient email, and that's it. I will send email during the transition. I do not need any additional things to do. So the transitions, first, they always need the information to which step they lead to. So I have step. I know that from this step I can execute same name parts, and this will take me to the step name parts set. And all of those, as you can see, are clickable. So if this is a large file, I will be still able to navigate them if I have my IDE configured properly. Then I can have some front-end options like assigning the icon, and I can also assign a form. So in this case, I have name prefix, first name, middle name, last name, and the suffix. And also for the first name and the last name, I'm assigning some validation. So they are required and they cannot be blank. The last one, and this is usually the tricky one, so I have the naming type, and if I would like to use the drop-down, I just need to specify the form type for this naming type, and this is entity type, so in options, I need to specify the class, and also which property of the entity should be displayed as the label. And that's it. I just run workflows definitions load, and let's see it in work. I can go to the user, for example, John. Oh, that's not it. After I loaded the definitions, I should dump the translation file and fill in the translation. So it will create something like this for me, and I just add labels to have the names for the steps and the name for the transition. So this is important. Otherwise, you will have some hashes, which is not usable. All right, so here I have user naming flow. I'm in the step, starting step name is not initialized, and I can start it. So I started the workflow. The workflow item was created with the current step already, and I can set name parts. Here, the values are preloaded because my entity have those fields, but I have some validation, right? I cannot make them empty, but I can, for example, remove Junior and Patrick. I can submit. I do not display them because I remember we played with some permissions, but I've changed them, and now I can reinitialize the name. For example, in this transition, I could also make those values to be null using the action to assign value. And I can set naming type, which will just display the dropdown of all the naming types I have. It is not required, so I can also make it blank. And that's it. I have the workflow. As you can see, it's a simple one. I do not have any special actions attached, but it will be super simple to develop this workflow to something more complex. Okay, guys, there are only 4 questions, so I don't think we need some break. We can answer them, and then it will be end of this webinar, actually end of whole series. So, Sebastian, if we have to change the default workflow to checkout, we have to extend this or create another one using the default. So as I told you, we do not extend workflows because first of all, you will have issues with solving any conflicts, and also they are not being merged by default. So you copy the original checkout, you paste it to your bundle, modify it, change the name, but use the same exclusive record group, so they will not be activated at the same time. Otherwise, you may have some issues. Also, Sebastian, if in some workflow we need to interact different user depending on which step, how can we do it? So, for example, for the checkouts, we have the checkout is an entity and you have access to it. So as a, for example, user, I can create a checkout. And if I do not have permission to do the last step, the checkout will be stored in this step. And then my front-end administrator, because as you're going to learn in the commerce, the front store users also have hierarchy. So I can have the buyer role and I have administrator. So the buyer will be able to create order. And if conditions are not met, he will not be able to submit. For example, the order total value is above some threshold. In this case, my administrator can log to his account. And as we are in the same business unit, for example, he will be able to see checkouts, so pending orders from his other users, and for example, approve them. And if he approves, he can also place the order by himself, or the user who created the order can log in again. His checkout will be approved, so he can perform the last transition, which will be to place order. Juan Carlos, is it possible to use files as attributes of the workflow? For example, when attaching an offline payment received during the checkout process. I haven't done this, but yeah, I think you can assign any attribute there. So if your entity, well, actually, yeah, you could just, for example, create relation for your checkout or for the order, and then use this field in your checkout form, of course, using file component, and it should work. I haven't tried this, but I don't see anything that would fail here. Oh, sorry, Sebastian. Okay, so I'll answer this again. No worry about it. Guys, we really have some time. So if you have any questions about Oro, or you can post it right now, or you can post it in Slack. I should still be able to respond them. If not today, maybe tomorrow or the next week. Also, you don't need to use this really Slack channel just for this webinar. The community on the Slack is really, really good, and we like to help. You also, I see, like to help each other a lot, which is great. So I will wait like 5 more minutes, and if there is no more questions, or maybe if there is no question in 2 minutes, this will be it actually for today and for this webinar. Okay, I can see some questions, which is great. So Karim, can we couple workflow with NPI? So workflow transition are available through the old API, which is already deprecated, but it should still work. Otherwise, depending on your needs, it's super simple to create a controller that would perform specific transition. The issue here is that, you know, for each transition, you may require different information to perform this transition. So, for example, if you only want to be able to approve some order through the API, it would be very simple to create a controller, and as we saw yesterday, you can create a custom endpoint. And then in this controller, you can use Workflow Manager to fetch specific workflow and perform specific transition, right? So it doesn't have to be done with the button. For example, we have workflow approvals in the email. You just click link in the email, and then it takes you to the controller. The controller knows about the workflow and about the transition name. And you can, using the Workflow Manager, you can perform specific transition for the specific workflow. Excuse me. And Alex, does the entity lose the state of current workflow if workflow is disabled, then enabled again? Can we define some rollback action on workflow disabled? Is it more like maintenance question? So, for sure you can create a migration that will migrate from one workflow to another, because I already had to do this once. And I would have to check about the state of the workflow. And for sure, you can create a workflow listener. And for specific workflow, if it is being disabled, you can execute some action. So for sure, you can do this manually. But if the state is lost, let's check. So for example, we have these users. We have John. So let's find this workflow item. And there is a workflow night, and this is the item for John. And it doesn't have any data, but let's add some data. Why not? And webinar demo true. Why not? Let's store it and let's disable it. If I break something, sorry. So let's go to workflows. And there is a user naming flow. Let's disable this, deactivate. So for sure, you could do a listener on this, check if this is the workflow you are looking for, and perform some events for all the workflow items in this workflow. So this is for sure doable. It shouldn't be difficult. I see it is disabled. Let's check the database already. Yep, the item is gone. So when you disable the workflow, the items are being gone. And actually, I remember that when I was doing the transition, I first enabled the workflow, I migrated the workflow items, and I then disabled the previous workflow. So yeah, as you can see, you are losing the step. But actually, this is really not something common. So usually you should think about the workflows at the beginning of the application. So if you need to customize, it's better to start customizing even a little bit, so then you can customize it further and you don't have to switch between the workflows. And okay, there are more questions. Perfect. Christian, will you be presenting the commerce training next week? Is it the same Zoom link? So now it will be not conducted by me. It will be by my friend Evgen. And I don't know the Zoom link. For sure, it will be emailed to you. Okay. And if you have time, can you show us how to test workflow or better jobs? So I'm not able to write the test for now. And which jobs do you mean? First of all, for workflow, the best tests you can write, I think, are the BHATs, because they're using the application, so you can click the button and go on through the workflow. And for the jobs, it really depends what jobs you mean. I think there are tests for import-export jobs. And for the message queue, as I remember, message queue is executed during the BHAT, so also you can test if the message queue is processed properly with some BHAT tests, for example. And also one thing I just nearly forgot. If you guys would have a second or just a few minutes, there will be survey sent to you at the end of this webinar today, probably in like 2 hours. If you have a moment to fill it, we would really appreciate, so we can know how we can make it better. And also I will post the link to this survey here in the chat. So it's a 7 questions, so approximately 5 minutes stop, and that's it. So you can click from this link, or you will have the link in the email. Marcos, if you need anything specific about this test, please, we can discuss this now, or you can post the question to the Slack and we can take it over there. Guys, any more questions? Anything? Okay, guys, I think that's it. Really thank you for joining. I hope this will help you to start with Oro, and you will get easier at the beginning because it's a big system and you can feel a little bit overwhelmed. And good luck. If you need to reach me, you can use email or you can use Slack, and I'll be glad to help. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.